There have been some bombshell new developments in the Jeffrey Epstein case. I believe about a week ago now, a prominent and well-respected former medical examiner in New York was hired by Jeffrey Epstein's brother, and after reviewing the information from the autopsy, he came to a conclusion different than the official investigation. The evidence more likely suggests that Jeffrey Epstein was murdered rather than committed suicide. This basically confirmed what we all suspected. Somebody did not want what Jeffrey Epstein knew to be made public. Somebody wanted to shut this whole shit down. Somebody wanted Jeffrey Epstein dead. Well, now there are reports coming out, I believe yesterday or the day before, that a reporter from ABC News was caught on a hot mic basically going off 2 months ago because this Jeffrey Epstein story that blew up, she had this very same story 3 years ago, but ABC wouldn't let her run it. In the video, Amy Robach is going off about how she had this interview with the star accuser and star witness in this Jeffrey Epstein case 3 years ago. They had photos. They had some of the flight logs and who was on Jeffrey Epstein's private plane. They knew about the private islands and the underage girls that were being trafficked on those planes and at those private islands. They even had information about Epstein's connections to Bill Clinton and Prince Andrew of the royal family. In the words of Amy Robach, quote, they had it all, but ABC still wouldn't let them run the story. And the story that ABC News is trying to run with now is that apparently, even though Amy Robach and her team had all of this information, the very same information that news outlets are running with today, they're saying that what Amy Robach had didn't meet ABC's editorial standards. That's why they never air the story. That is comical from right there. Off rip, you should know that's bullshit. Quote, it did not meet their editorial standards to run on air. Like I said, that is horse shit. Any of these mainstream news outlets, ABC, CNN, MSNBC, Fox News, when there's a high profile story like this and their excuse for why they didn't run it is because it didn't meet editorial standards, and there's also a very clear conflict of interest between the subject of the investigation and the people at that news outlet, almost 100% of the time, they are lying out of their ass. Because you know what? None of these outlets have any type of rigorous editorial standards of that they put every story through before it makes it on air. And ABC News is one of the worst offenders. I have a list of some of the most erroneous bullshit stories that ABC let run on their network that clearly did not go through any type of editorial process. And these are all egregious examples from just one of their shitty reporters. Just one of the many shitty reporters that they have working at ABC News. This is a list of the horseshit stories that they allowed Brian Ross to run on ABC News, unabated. In October 2001, Brian Ross twice, he linked Iraq to anthrax attacks that happened in the United States. This was based on absolutely no evidence, did not corroborate this, and he ran this bullshit on ABC News, prime time, twice. And this was particularly egregious because a lot of people point to that epic failure of journalism from Brian Ross as one of the many examples of the mainstream media helping the Bush administration manufacture consent to start the illegal war in Iraq. Just every bullshit charge you can levy against Iraq, do it. They have weapons of mass destruction. They attacked us on 9/11. They're responsible for anthrax attacks in the United States. Make it all up. Doesn't matter if you have evidence. It doesn't matter if you corroborated it. Doesn't matter if you checked your source. Just run the stories. It doesn't matter. During the 2012 coverage of the mass shooting in Aurora, Colorado, Brian Ross went on live TV and said that the shooter was a member of the Colorado Tea Party based off of nothing other than they shared the same name. The shooter had the same name as somebody who was on the list. And that was enough information for Brian Ross to go on live TV and accuse somebody in the Tea Party of being a mass shooter. So where was the editorial process, huh? Where was the double sourcing and confirming your information before you let it run on air? In 2017, they still haven't fired Brian Ross yet. And those weren't even all the controversies in his career at ABC News, but those were some of the bullshit stories that they've let him run on air. And they want to talk about they didn't let Amy Robach run this Epstein story because it didn't meet the editorial standards. Okay. 2017, Brian Ross given a 4-week suspension for pushing the bullshit Russiagate story, and he came out on TV breaking news. Michael Flynn is about to testify that Donald Trump gave him orders to contact Russia during the presidential campaign. Breaking news story across all the networks for the entire day. When Brian Ross gave that announcement, it dropped stock prices 350 points. Now, later in the day, Brian Ross was forced to come out and do a retraction and correct his own dumbass. And he said, okay, got the story wrong a little bit, just a little bit. So Donald Trump didn't tell Michael Flynn to make contact with the Russians before the election. He told him to do it after the election. That's a huge difference in the story, because at that point, Donald Trump is the president-elect and Michael Flynn is his incoming national security advisor. So it makes all the sense in the world if Michael Flynn was communicating with Russian leaders on behalf of Donald Trump, and Russian leaders and other leaders around the world on behalf of Donald Trump and the incoming administration. But that's not the story Brian Ross wanted to tell. He wanted to push the Russiagate story, which is that Donald Trump was working with the Russians to get elected. I go through all of that to make this point. If ABC News is telling me they have journalistic standards already, I'm laughing. But if they tell me they didn't run this apparently well-sourced and well-documented and easily corroborated story about Jeffrey Epstein, Prince Andrews, and Bill Clinton, they didn't run that story because it didn't meet their journalistic standards, their editorial standards to run on air, I'm going to call bullshit. Because like I just told you, it ran through that list, ABC News does not have any editorial standards. They'll run anything. Just about a couple weeks ago, when this whole thing with the Kurds and Turkey was going on, they used footage of bombs going off at a Kentucky gun range and was running that on their primetime news broadcast Sunday night and pretending like that was footage that they just captured in Kurdish territory because of the conflict between Turkey and the Kurds. Completely misinforming their audience on a regular basis, allowing Brian Ross to come out and push these bullshit stories that are not fact-checked, that are not sourced. Anytime Brian Ross gets a feeling, he just goes, he could throw up the breaking news banner and come out on ABC News live and just say whatever the fuck he feels like without apparently anybody asking him, hey, you sure that's true? To everyone who is not being paid by ABC News, it appears that the reason why they buried this story is because they had a glaring conflict of interest. At least one glaring conflict of interest. Now, one of the reasons that Amy Robach gave as to why ABC News would possibly try to bury this story is that they were trying to secure an interview with Kate and Will of the royal family. And if ABC ran that Epstein story that connected Jeffrey Epstein, notorious child sex trafficker, to Prince Andrew, there's no way that the royal family was going to grant that interview. And in fact, Amy Robach said once they heard that they were even looking into this, they were already putting pressure on ABC to drop the story. So even if it was just the typical news outlet whoring themselves for access to wealthy elite figures, that'd already be bad enough. But the story gets even stranger when you find out one of the high-level people involved with securing this meeting with the royal family, and also has a big say about what stories run on ABC News, is George Stephanopoulos, former campaign staffer to Bill Clinton and former White House communications director to Bill Clinton. As a matter of fact, George Stephanopoulos was at a party with Epstein, hosted by Epstein, for Prince Andrew, about 5 years before Amy Robach came to ABC News with this story, and 2 years after Jeffrey Epstein had already been prosecuted for sex trafficking underage girls. And it looks like George Stephanopoulos, former staffer of Bill Clinton, may have had a direct role in burying the story at ABC News. And further evidence that makes me believe that George Stephanopoulos played a direct role in burying the story on behalf of Bill Clinton, at the very least, possibly for Prince Andrew, or to cover his own ass. But another piece of evidence that's pointing to he covered this up for Bill Clinton is, if you follow Amy Robach's timeline here. So this hot mic was recorded about 2 months ago, and she's saying she had this Jeffrey Epstein story 3 years from then. So at the very least, we're talking about August 2016. She went to ABC News with this Jeffrey Epstein story and tried to run it on air. What was happening at that time? Obviously, the 2016 election between Hillary Clinton and Donald Trump. But we also know that at the time, Ronan Farrow, who was working at MSNBC at the time and was trying to publish the Harvey Weinstein story, he also got shut down by NBC News for, quote, not meeting editorial standards. And he was also pressured by the Clinton campaign themselves to drop the story. And Ronan Farrow had to leave NBC News and take his story to the New Yorker to be published 3 months later. What a coincidence. Two of the most prolific sex criminals and sex trafficker, arguably in the world, with ties to Bill Clinton, are about to be exposed around the same time, and the Clinton allies in the media. And we already know that NBC was basically an arm of the Clinton campaign. We know Bill Clinton's ties to George Stephanopoulos and other people in ABC's newsroom. And real quick, side point, I'm going to say it since apparently nobody else wants to say it. Every day that passes, it's looking more and more likely that Bill Clinton had something to do with Jeffrey Epstein's death. And the amount of things pointing in that direction are just too many to be a coincidence. The closer Jeffrey Epstein came to a trial, the more information we were learning about how close him and Bill Clinton were. We were learning about how Bill Clinton lied about how he was on that jet dozens of times and how he was at Jeffrey Epstein's private island. Those documents came out right before Jeffrey Epstein's death. I believe the day before Jeffrey Epstein's death. It is not a stretch to say that if Jeffrey Epstein lived, if he cooperated with the investigators and turned over evidence on all these people he had dirt on, there was a very real possibility that either photographs or videos or documents, some kind of proof would have linked Jeffrey Epstein with the underage girls, directly with the underage girls that Jeffrey Epstein was sex trafficking. So from the beginning, Bill Clinton, of all people, arguably had the most to lose if Jeffrey Epstein cooperated and went to trial. And now we have this news story about ABC News burying the Jeffrey Epstein story, and it looked like Bill Clinton, or at least people close to Bill Clinton working on his behalf, also played a role in keeping this under wraps way back then. So yeah, Jeffrey Epstein had dirt on a lot of powerful people, other world leaders, apparently other presidents of other countries, executives at powerful corporations in the United States and around the world. Former politicians, like I believe there was a Senate Majority Leader on his client's list or some former documents with him. That also came out the day before he died. There were a lot of people who Jeffrey Epstein had dirt on. Nobody, from what we know right now, what's publicly available right now, nobody has done more to make sure that this Jeffrey Epstein story does not come out than Bill Clinton and arguably the royal family. So if now we're getting a medical examiner saying that Jeffrey Epstein was almost likely murdered, to me, the prime suspects look like Bill Clinton and the people in the royal family, because they did not want this Epstein story out, and that has been tremendously clear. And the more information that comes out, it becomes even more abundantly clear that they've been doing everything in their power to make sure that this story does not come out. So if you have Jeffrey Epstein sitting in a prison cell looking like he's about to cooperate and light a match and burn the whole shit down, you look like you're out of options, and it's not really possible to have every single news outlet bury the story like they did before. So your only other options is to make sure that Jeffrey Epstein can't tell his side of the story, which it looks like that's why somebody had him murdered. So this bombshell story about ABC News burying this Jeffrey Epstein, Bill Clinton, and Prince Andrew story is just another damning indictment of our mainstream media. There's no way in hell I'm believing that they didn't run this story because it didn't meet whatever editorial standards that they have. Amy Robach in that video said they had photos, they had information about the flight logs, they had information about his private islands and the girls that he would bring to sex traffic there. They had an interview with the star witness and star victim of this whole thing right now, 3 years ago. And this story is a perfect encapsulation of how the media fucking sold their soul for access. Some of the most powerful people in our entire society in the world implicated in a child sex ring. And they all look the other way because the very same people implicated are their buddies and their friends and the people that they hit the cocktail circuit with and the people who they meet up with at the golf clubs and who they see at fancy resorts around the world, the people who they're cordial with and go to fundraisers with. And because of that, they were asleep at the wheel. They decided not to do their job, arguably when the people needed them to do it the most, when everybody apparently was in the pocket of Jeffrey Epstein, from prosecutors to former presidents and senators, world leaders. Everybody was in the pocket of Jeffrey Epstein. Everybody facilitated his child sex trafficking ring. And the media is supposed to be adversarial to power, adversarial to the establishment. And if they were, from the jump, they would have looked at this Jeffrey Epstein shit and exposed everybody who's implicated in this. Everybody down to Acosta, who was the prosecutor who gave him that illegal plea agreement that let him skate on crimes that anybody else would have been locked up for the rest of their lives for. If the media were not whores for access and softball interviews, they would have run this story and they would have burned bridges because that's exactly what they're supposed to be doing. But again, they're whores for access. They sold their souls for access a long time ago. And this should serve as a cautionary tale to people like TYT, who have also found themselves falling into this trap of whoring themselves out for access lately. There are just some times where access is not worth it. And I would say that's most of the time. You can still do a good show. You can still do good journalism. You can still do good commentary without getting direct quotes from whoever it is you're talking about. You can do it without having direct sit down softball interviews with whoever the story is about. Because I'm not saying that TYT would cover up this Jeffrey Epstein story. I have no evidence to prove that. But what I do know for a fact is I'm watching them with my own eyes before my own eyes make compromises and do very, for lack of a better word, sleazy things to maintain access with people who they think will get them views. Which brings me to this point that I want to make about selling integrity for access in media. We all know for a flat fact that this Jeffrey Epstein story is not an outlier. This isn't the only time that ABC News or any news outlet has buried a story because it might make people who they are friends with look bad. Everybody remembers back when it was AMI in the National Enquirer and there were stories coming out about how they catch and kill stories for Donald Trump and other wealthy elites all the time, where they pay someone like Stormy Daniels for the rights to their story, whatever their scandalous story is. They pretend like they're going to run it, and then at some point they just come out and say, yeah, we're not going to run the story, and then they just bury it. And now that they own the rights to the story, they bought the rights from the whoever it is who came forward. Now that person can't go and bring that story to anybody else. So that was a huge business practice at AMI and the National Enquirer, where they would just catch and kill stories for people who they were close to. And there were reports of now, after the National Enquirer is basically blown up and they've become the center of different investigations, there are now reports coming out about how there are vaults of all these stories that they would catch and kill over the years, including a bunch on Donald Trump. So it's not a one-time thing is the point that I'm trying to make. All of these media outlets do that. All of them bury stories for personal, financial, and professional reasons like access. And it's very clear too, because how do we have these such powerful news outlets, news organizations, ABC, CNN, MSNBC, all these multi-billion-dollar news organizations with the resources to investigate every and any story you can imagine? How is it possible that we have organizations like this, but we still don't get any hard-hitting investigative pieces on corporate executives, or on corporate greed, or on intentional pollution from these chemical companies or energy companies like Exxon? Where are those investigative pieces, huh? You think that they could, between all these different news organizations, they can't come up with a team to do investigative reporting into the widespread, rampant status quo corruption that's going on in Washington, D.C., the flat out bribery that's going on in some cases, especially the nasty, dirty things going on with lobbyists behind closed doors. Where are those stories? I know for a goddamn fact that they exist, because it wasn't that long ago where there was a scandal of some senators and some congresspeople who were caught red-handed owning stocks in some of these medical companies, medical device companies, and pharmaceutical companies, and then writing legislation that would boost the stock prices and give them a giant pile of cash. That was apparently an open secret up until Donald Trump nominated his Health and Human Services secretary, who was in Congress and was apparently partaking in that corruption when it comes to the medical device stocks and the pharmaceutical stocks. Nobody was talking about it until Donald Trump nominated one of those Congress people to be his Health and Human Services secretary. So how many stories of that? How many different industries do you think that's happening in, huh? How many people in Congress do you think are participating in that type of corruption? My guess is the majority, probably the overwhelming majority. So this story of about ABC News burying this Epstein story, it raises questions. It raises questions about what are these different news outlets choosing to investigate, but more importantly, how many times have their reporters or sources come to them with these bombshell allegations, these bombshell stories with documented proof and evidence about elites and people in the establishment who they may be close with? How many times have these news outlets taken stories like that and thrown them into the vault like they did with this Jeffrey Epstein story and just buried it? How many times has that happened? I want to look at the AMI, the National Enquirer vault that all these different news outlets have. I want to see what stories that CNN's burying, what stories NBC is burying, what stories ABC is burying, because like Amy Robach just went off about, ABC News buried the story of the decade for apparently some shady reasons.